Hello, welcome back to Early Modern Philosophy, where we talk about the period from Descartes to Kant. And I'm trying to give you an overview of this whole period. In the previous episodes, we talked about how early modern philosophy develops from ancient Greek philosophy and then the philosophy of the Middle Ages, and how it relates to the developments of the time, political, scientific developments. And this time we will talk a little more about that, how science, politics, discoveries influenced early modern philosophy. And so next time we will start talking about Descartes, hopefully. So let's go on. We said already the Europeans began exploring the world around the end of the 1400s. 1492 was Columbus' discovery of the Americas. Then a little later, 1519, 1522 was Magellan sailing around the world. And so by then, it was clear that the Earth is a sphere, that it is limited, that there is no way you can fall off the edges. And we also have developments in astronomy, of course, that were hugely important for the science and the philosophy of the time. And one is Copernicus, 1473 to 1543. He wrote about how the solar system is heliocentric, which means that the sun is in the center of it and the planets go around it. This is opposed to the geocentric worldview, where you would think the Earth is in the middle. This was what the ancients believed. This is also what the church at some point was favoring, because the idea is that God created the Earth primarily, and then all these other things, the sun and the moon, they just rotate around the Earth, because the Earth is the important point where human development and human salvation is happening, and all these other bodies in the sky are just there for decoration, more or less, or to provide the light. So in Christian worldview, based on Genesis, it would be a little weird for the Earth to be traveling around the sun, because then the Earth is just one of many planets. It's not anymore the center of the universe. But this is what Copernicus said. And later we have William Harvey in a totally different area, 1578 to 1655. He described the blood circulation in the human body. Interestingly, he wasn't really a great scientist in the modern sense that he would describe it, free of assumptions and just based on his observations. But instead, he also had this idea of the Copernican system, the Copernican revolution, where things rotate around each other and the sun is at the center. So I would think that some organs are in the center and some things like the blood, go around these organs around the heart that is in the center like the sun. So he had more of a mythical understanding, actually, or an astronomical understanding of the body. But still, it's a big milestone in the history of medicine that now we knew about the blood circulation. Previously, it was not clear how the blood goes around in the body. And so rationalism and empiricism, both start with a desire to understand, to explore the physical world. And for rationalism in particular, the model is geometry. This is the best science because it relies only on things that the mind can know. The other thing, of course, is astronomy. Orbits are purely mathematical constructs that work according to the laws of physics, to the laws of geometry, at least in the Copernican system, right? There were no irregularities. These were just nice circles, or later, they became ellipses that can be described geometrically. And so the whole sky suddenly became an application of geometry. And this was important because this showed early researchers convinced them that they can understand with their minds, with their geometry, they can understand actually how the universe works. Empiricism now emphasizes that knowledge is derived from the senses. There are no abstract laws, mathematical proportions, which are the most, important tools for the scientist, but the most important tools are actually observation. And David Hume was one of the greatest proponents of this, not the first one, but one of the most important, 1711 to 1776. We will talk about him later in this class much more. And then we have the Industrial Revolution at the time, 1760 to to 1820. And this was a huge development again, a social jump, because then suddenly products became much, much cheaper. In the previous periods, everything had to be made by hand, all your clothing had to be made by hand, so even making, a t-shirt like this was a huge effort. And then accordingly, the t-shirt would be very expensive, so you had only very few clothes that you could own, because you either had to make them yourself, or you had to buy them from somebody who made them over a long period of time. This person needs to eat, obviously, he needs to house himself, so therefore clothes would be very expensive. And then suddenly, with the Industrial Revolution, which started with clothes, with fabric processing in industries, it would become much more cheap, much more available. And all kinds of other industrial processes later, steel and coal, and totally transformed the world and started the railways and the communication systems and transport systems all over Europe and the Americas that brought the modern age about. In 1752, which is not so far away from, it's in the lifetime of David Hume, we have research in electricity already by Benjamin Franklin. The kite experiment, where he flew a kite into a thunderstorm and almost got himself killed. And so the connection between empiricism and science is important, because they go hand in hand, in the sense that modern science thinks that we should base our knowledge on observations and experiment. And this is exactly what empiricism says. We cannot make up the laws of nature just by, thinking like we do in geometry, but we have to do it by observing reality. In 1789, we have the French Revolution again, very close to this period, and the American Declaration of Independence, 1776. So you see, these are just, 20 years, 15 years apart. So things in history are not isolated. In school, often they teach us that you have to learn one thing, you have to memorize one thing, you have to memorize another thing, and you never get to see the connection. But actually, all these things are connected, right? The American Declaration of Independence comes, French Revolution comes, at the same time utilitarianism in philosophy comes about with Jeremy Bentham, at the same time the Industrial Revolution happens. So all these movements are connected. And the main ideas of these movements now, of these two political movements, is the independence of the individual, freedom and equality for everyone, and the pursuit of individual happiness. And then when we say individual happiness, this leads to utilitarianism, the idea that ethics can be founded on pursuing individual happiness. And then we have the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment begins already much earlier. It begins, sometimes it's said to begin with Spinoza, or to begin even with Descartes. But the main force of the Enlightenment comes a little later, probably many would say with Immanuel Kant, who lived from 1724 to 1804. And he wrote specifically about the Enlightenment. He says the Enlightenment is man's emergence, I'm quoting this, from his self-imposed immaturity. So, man's emergence from self-imposed immaturity. And what is the immaturity is, of course, the religion, the belief in the dogmas of the church that are replacing, or were replacing in the Middle Ages, scientific approaches to reality, and then suddenly we break out of that. Scholastic philosophy is left behind, and Descartes goes beyond that, and he tries to find a new way to ground philosophy. And later the empiricists, try also to get rid of rationalism and find a new way to ground philosophy in just experiment, in just looking at it. And this thing has not been decided. So, these two approaches exist in parallel. It's not like empiricism does away with rationalism. Even today we have more rationalist movements in philosophy and more empiricist, and the same in science. But they are both driven by the wish to understand the world as an individual person, by doing science, by going back to this, you can say, pre-Socratic attempt to look at the world and just to explain the world immanently out of itself without needing God. And so this age of enlightenment goes from the late 17th century to about the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815, and then we are already firmly in the 19th century, and we have tons of application of science, and in this industrial revolution and so on becomes commonplace and changes society completely. And we are in the 19th century, which is already then developing electricity and cars and transport systems and railways and so on. So there is this shift of interest from theological themes. Copleston says, one of the writers of the history of philosophy, a shift of interest, I read it to you from, here's my screen, right, from theological themes to a study of nature and of man without explicit reference to God. And examples of this, you can look at ethics. Previously, it was derived from the law of nature or from divine laws, right, commands that God has given us, while modern philosophers try to solve the ethical problems without religion, just by using logic and reason. And this started, perhaps you could say, in modern times with Spinoza, who had a social contract theory, and later Kant had his own deontological ethics based on reason. And you see the same development in politics. Originally, you have the divine figure of the king who is regulating everything and is in analogy with the father or the god, right, who regulates everything. And this king god or king father then gets replaced by the subjects, by the individual human beings who, in a democracy, determine their own fate and execute their own will. So two important words to remember for this period of enlightenment, because Kant puts them into the center of his attention, are a priori and a posteriori. And so you need to remember them. So the a is a Latin prefix that means from, from prior knowledge or from knowledge after. And what does after mean? After means after the experience, right? So a priori means prior to experience. This is knowledge that we have before we have had any sensory confirmation. So if you didn't have any senses, assuming you could not observe the world at all, let's say you're born just a mind, without any sensory equipment, or you're locked into a dark room, you have no access to any senses, what can you know about the world? And of course, this is just a, thought experiment, but you can imagine that such a brain, perhaps a disembodied brain, a disembodied intelligence without senses, could discover the laws of geometry. It could discover the laws of mathematics. So you would be able to do mathematics, you would be able to do geometry, but you would not be able to say, what colors are, for example. You would not be able to say that the sun is shining every day or the stars move, around the sky, because these are all things that are based on observation. And so a priori knowledge is the knowledge that I can have without observation. So 2 + 2 is 4 is an a priori knowledge, or all daughters have a mother is another, right? Is a kind of a priori knowledge, because I don't need to observe any actual daughters. I can say it just from the definition, right? If I know what a daughter is an organism, let's say a human that has been born by another female organism, which is a mother. So by knowing that daughters are born from mothers, I can conclude that all daughters have a mother without actually needing any additional knowledge about the world. I don't need to observe daughters and mothers. And the opposite of that is a posteriori knowledge, post-experience, knowledge that I get from experience, post-sensory input, knowledge that we have from the senses, and we cannot have without sensory perception. And these would be things like, it's raining. Well, we cannot say it's raining without actually looking out of the window. Or water boils at 100 degrees Celsius. Even the fact that water boils, it turns, from a liquid to a gas and so on. These are things you have to observe. You cannot know it without any observation. And so the main idea of rationalism now is the rejection of supernatural forces, God, and replacing them with reason. So you say human reason is what creates, the world in our minds. We create the world with our reason. And sense perception is not reliable. So the rationalist will always say, I can observe things, but I can be mistaken. When I'm drunk, for example, then what I observe is not reliable. Or when I take drugs, LSD, then I have all sorts of hallucinations which are not reliable experience. And who knows, perhaps I am in my everyday life, I'm just drugged, or I am just dreaming, right? Like Descartes says, I don't know if what I think that is happening right now is really happening. Is there really a camera filming me now, or am I just imagining it, right? I can never be really sure about that. But I can be sure that 2 + 2 is 4. I can be totally certain about that. And so we have these rationalist philosophers who have this position, primarily, Descartes, Spinoza, and Leibniz, and we will talk about them later. So truth is not based on experience. Truth comes from the mind. Rationalism believes in self-evident principles, and from this self-evident means they are clear, they cannot be disputed, and from this we derive all sorts of truths about reality. And this is a strong influence on this is, like we said, mathematics, astronomy, geometry, which are the ideal forms of this kind of reasoning. And the goal is to find certainty, to find statements that we can be certain about so that we cannot be deceived about them and we have true knowledge about the universe. Empiricism now is the other side, is the other camp, right? And empiricism says knowledge is based on perception, and here we have primarily Locke, Berkeley, and Hume, who are the main supporters of this camp. And generally, empiricism comes slightly after rationalism, being a reaction to it. So the empiricist philosophers see that the rationalist project does not quite work, because a rationalist cannot explain how I know all these empirical facts, right? For example, that it rains. I cannot know this from geometry alone. So I need to have some kind of sensory input. And then since I need sensory input anyway, then why not try to construct the whole of my experience out of sensory input? Why do I even need to assume that I know anything before? Empiricists say if we observe small babies, they don't have anything in their mind. It's not like a small baby knows geometry. It could know geometry, but it does not. How does a small baby know geometry? It looks at shapes, it touches them, and then from this it develops its own geometry. So even things that are constructions of the mind, like geometry, actually in human development begin with the senses, begin as empirical projects. And generally, empiricism, I said this before, is more of a British development, more of an in the English sphere, right, of influence. And rationalism is more a continental project, European project, French and German project. There are exceptions to both of these, but there is this split. And this is what today we still have as continental and analytic philosophy, where analytic philosophy is more centered on English and American universities and cultural, spheres, while continental philosophy is more on the continent of Europe, so more in France, Germany. Empiricism would not deny that there is a priori knowledge about the world. There is in mathematics and geometry, but important knowledge about the actual world comes from a posteriori information that we get from experience. So I think that's enough for the moment to talk about empiricism, rationalism, and how this relates to the movements, intellectual, political, social movements of the time. Next time, we will talk about the Enlightenment. So stay here, go to the next video, and see how the Enlightenment develops out of this period that we are talking now. Thank you.